Hey everyone, Doug Maurice, along with Ari Wasserman and Bill Landis, here for our weekly Ohio State Big Ten show. Ari, how you doing today?
Feeling great. Best day of my life.
Bill, can you match that, Bill?
It's not the best day of my life, but I feel pretty good.
Okay, I'm going to call you Condi from now on, and I'm going to call you Barry for the rest of the show. And I don't know who I'm going to be, but we are going to pretend that we are in the College Football Selection Committee room, at least for the first couple minutes of this show, because the first College Football Selection Committee poll, the first top 25, will come out a week from today. Next Tuesday evening, everyone's going to be sitting around excited about what this committee, are you going to be excited? Maybe not excited.
I'm going to be excited.
Curious about what this committee is going to do, because I have come to despise polls. They're meaningless. I get in fights with people. But this is a poll that's going to matter, because this is going to be a window into the thinking of the people who are actually going to decide who gets to play in the college football playoff. And Ohio State is starting to be in that discussion. So we want to think about how the committee might be thinking about Ohio State right now. So Barry, you're a former successful football coach in the Big Ten.
I am.
You are an athletic director. You've been around the game. You know what's up. Talk a little bit about this Ohio State team. Talk about what impresses you about this Ohio State team right now as you think about their case to be in the playoff, Barry.
What impresses me about Ohio State to this point has to be the progression of the offense. When you look at the first two games against Navy, probably not as dominant as they should have looked against a team like Navy. Against Virginia Tech, obviously the problems were well documented. Since Virginia Tech, I think you can make the case that Ohio State has had, if not the most explosive, one of the most explosive offenses in the country.
Barry, there's a lot of great offenses out there, though.
True, but
what differentiates this Ohio State offense to make you say one of the most explosive, Barry?
the playmakers, the guy, I mean, a lot of these high-powered offenses, a lot of people talk about the quarterback, and you can talk a lot about Ohio State's quarterback, J.T. Barrett, but I think it's guys like Dontre Wilson and Michael Thomas and Jalen Marshall and Ezekiel Elliott. Got that right. Barry Alvarez knows how to pronounce his name. Those kind of the guys I think are the guys that set Ohio State's offense apart. I don't think you can. There's maybe a handful of rosters in the country where you can look at their offense and say this team has as many playmakers as Ohio State has.
Condi, they have been impressive on the field. They are in a great mix though right now with 16 one-loss teams from the Power 5 conferences. This is a big mess for us to try to figure out. Notre Dame, Duke, Kansas State, Baylor, TCU, Michigan State, Ohio State, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Arizona State, Arizona, Utah, Georgia, Alabama, and Auburn, all with one loss. And then we have the 3 undefeated teams. When you look at their resume, Condi, what do you think about the teams they've beaten, the team they lost to? How do you evaluate that?
Well, sometimes I wonder. I can't do that the entire show. My voice is too profoundly manly.
I don't think she sounds like that.
Yeah,
but
I did my best. I'm not Brad Pitt. I just look like him. I think when you look at the losses, you have to look at who the teams lost to and what they were when they lost to them. So Ohio State gets some bad credit and some good credit because on one hand, they lost to a Virginia Tech team who has since lost 3 times. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they were playing their first home night game with a freshman quarterback who wasn't supposed to start this year. And he might have been overwhelmed at the beginning of the year by the environment. Now, Ohio State had 3 drives in the fourth quarter to have a chance to tie it, and they couldn't manage a first down, maybe because J.T. Barrett was not who he is today. In the time since, Ohio State has racked up 4 straight wins of more than 50 points. They haven't been tested. J.T. Barrett has been efficient, has more, probably arguably, I don't know where he ranks nationally, but not very many quarterbacks in the country have matched what he's done statistically.
His rating is up there. His rating's in the top 5.
Number 3.
Ohio State is not the team that they were when they lost.
Okay, but do we throw out the loss? As we're thinking about this, you look at Alabama and Auburn, for instance. Their losses are to Ole Miss and Mississippi State. You look at Oregon, lost to an Arizona team that has been pretty good so far. Michigan State's only losses to Oregon. Notre Dame's only losses to Florida State.
Yeah.
A lot of these other one-loss teams their loss is to a really good team. Do we just throw out this Ohio State loss, or do they have to be responsible for losing at home to a team that has 3 losses now?
We're talking about what the first poll is going to be and where we put them. And right now, Ohio State's on the outside looking in on that because there are other teams that have losses that are more excusable, better losses. I mean, I think that Notre Dame, they're probably in over Ohio. I mean, you can go down this list. I mean,
there are better losses on this list for sure.
And Ohio State's been impressive, but I think what it's going to come down to is the losses are going to speak more than the wins.
Well, how much can you overlook a loss? As you are evaluating this over the course of the season, Condi, can you give them a mulligan? Or will that always be an important part of their resume?
I think you can give them a mulligan, but I think other teams get mulligans too.
How about you on the mulligans? Do you believe in mulligans for this?
I do, yeah. I think the argument that loss to Virginia Tech was a fluke is kind of valid, like what Ari/Condi said about the freshman quarterback, first home game, a young team. It was just it was a weird situation. They didn't play well, and they have to live with the consequences of that. But I think there is such thing as getting a mulligan for a loss. Yeah.
I don't know that I'm as willing to give a mulligan. I think strength of schedule will help you with the mulligan. If you've got a lot of good wins against good teams, maybe I'm a little more apt to do that. What about strength of schedule? Let's talk about strength of schedule versus beatdowns of the teams you do play. Ohio State, strength of schedule right now, obviously not going to be that high. It's going to get better when they play Michigan State. If they would win that game and get to a Big Ten title game, it will increase. Right now, how do you balance their strength of schedule is not as good, but they're scoring 50 points a game?
Well, the problem is that you can't necessarily always tell how good Ohio State is by them beating up on inferior opponents. And, you want Ohio State to have another marquee win to prove that Virginia Tech game wasn't a fluke. Maybe Virginia Tech is still the most, they're maybe not the best team they've played since, but maybe the most talented that could show up for one night and do it the right way. Have they played another team that has the same type of talent as Virginia Tech that could muster it all up and everything go well for one night enough to beat Ohio State? I don't know the answer to that question.
But if you are comparing Ohio State to, for instance, a one-loss team from the SEC West that is just going to play a tougher schedule, could you rank Ohio State, a one-loss Ohio State team, ahead of a one-loss SEC West team, that team has a tougher schedule? Nobody could really argue that, but Ohio State has been dominant. Could you do that, or would you always rank the SEC West team higher because they've played more good teams?
I think just based on what the SEC team has on their schedule, I think beating a very good team is more impressive than beating a bad team by a lot.
Is there anything Ohio State can do about that, or is that just sort of what they're stuck with?
Change your mind by going and playing the best team on the road and beating them up a little bit.
How about you? Is there anything they could do? This whole discussion and what comes out in that first poll on Tuesday, this is all preemptive because, as has been the case since before the season started, this Big Ten season is going to come down to Ohio State and Michigan State in East Lansing in primetime on November 8th. This is all positioning. This is the early laps of the race, getting in position. If you lose that game, you wreck and you're into the wall and you're out of the race. We get that. But you want to be in a good spot going into there. So can Ohio State, by beating up teams, compete with teams that have also one loss but a better strength of schedule?
Yeah, I think they can. I think people, it seems even more so, are fascinated by teams scoring a bunch of points and blowing teams out. I think kind of regardless of who the opponent is. Now, if Ohio State was beating like FCS teams 16-0, obviously that doesn't matter. But if they beat Maryland handily to score 50 points against Maryland, Maryland can finish with, 8-9 wins. Mm-hmm. Does that win might look a lot better to somebody at the end of the year if Ohio State goes through the schedule and blows everybody out, beat Michigan State, and Michigan State blows everybody else out except for Ohio State and Oregon. I think there's a case to be made that Ohio State can get in based on their margin of victory against subpar teams. Yeah.
I personally think that beating very good teams week in and week out by 7-10 is more impressive than beating bad teams by 40 every week.
I think this discussion in this room is going to be very interesting, and I think it's going to be different than the basketball committee discussion in some ways because you have a lot of former coaches, at least a decent amount of former coaches and former on-the-field football people in this room. I've talked to Gene Smith about when he was the committee of the basketball selection, the chair of the basketball selection committee, and he's a football guy. He played football at Notre Dame. He was an assistant coach, then he became an AD, and he always talked about he would sort of, sometimes sort of yield to the basketball knowledge of the people on that committee when you're talking basketball. But still, that's an AD conference commissioner group. This football group does have some outsiders who aren't doing things right now, who are football people. It has Tyrone Willingham. It has Barry Alvarez, who's an AD but is a former coach. Has Tom Osborne. Has Oliver Luck, who's an AD but is a former football guy. I'm very curious about how that football coaching mentality discussion informs this poll and informs these decisions. Because on one hand, I think coaches might be more willing to forgive a loss and say, you play 13 weeks, you can't be up every week. It happens to everybody, doesn't mean anything about who you are. I'm throwing out Ohio State's loss. I believe they're this team. But I also think those same coaches could say, I've been in that room, and when you are playing a monster every Saturday, you cannot be down. You get beaten up and you have no time to recover and you're playing another top 25 team. That schedule is an impossible thing to deal with, and when you're playing patsies, it's a much easier thing to do. So I think they could have the loss forgiven, but I also think that strength of schedule, that every week thing with the teams who are playing top 25 teams could actually come into play even more, which is, I think, 2 SEC teams is still, in my mind, very, very possible. The math is not hard to figure out that you could get 2 one-loss teams out of the SEC West, and when right now, we don't know what their poll is going to say. Right now in the AP poll, that 4 of the top 5 teams are not only from the SEC, they're from the SEC West. So if Alabama and Ole Miss, or Alabama and Mississippi State, or Auburn and Mississippi State finish with 1 loss, one of them goes to the SEC title game and the other one doesn't get to go, but it has 1 loss, I do not see any way in which both those teams don't get in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both could be true, right? I mean, Ohio State could be a really good team that had a bad night and was very impressive, and then the SEC West could have 2 teams. It's just which one will the committee, which one will we think is more impressive?
Right.
And I think that's what's most exciting about what we're going to, if I break character for a second, see on Tuesday is how they're actually thinking at this point in the year.
Because I think it's possible that the committee members could think differently than pollsters think, than sports writers like me in the AP poll think, than coaches who have their SIDs or operations people fill out a ballot in 5 minutes think. These are people, there's a story in USA Today about talking about sort of how they go through this. They're watching games on Saturday, they have games on their iPads, they have raw coaches film, they're watching a lot of games. I think it's possible they can get too inside the game. They are going to have some stats, they are going to use analytics, that's part of what they're doing. I'm a little nervous about a committee that says, boy, Mississippi State's left guard, when he pulls, he does a great, it's like, well, who won?
Yeah.
I think you can get a little bit too inside the film when in the end, if you have an 8-4 team whose offensive line is awesome, but they lost 4 games, I don't care how good their offensive line is. You have 4 losses, you're not in the playoff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So when you think about where Ohio State is though right now, again, we asked this question on the show a couple weeks ago and said, is a Big Ten team going to be in? We all said no. Our guess right now, no Big Ten team in the playoff. Is anything changed about that in your mind? Or when you look at, is Florida State going to run it in the ACC? If they do, they're in. You think about possibly 2 SEC teams. You think about Oregon getting back on its feet in the Pac-12. You think about Notre Dame with a good loss to Florida State. Will they run it? Anything changed in your mind about whether you think a Big Ten team gets in?
No, I don't think anything has changed. I think I've said it multiple times that too much needs to happen for either Ohio State or Michigan State to get in that 4-team playoff. And there's the teams in front of them, the losses that the 1-loss teams that are in front of them. I just don't see how you can argue that if you're putting Ohio State on paper next to Notre Dame, whose only losses to Florida State, and Ohio State lost to Virginia Tech, that might have 5 losses at the end of the year.
Right.
How can you argue that Ohio State deserves to get in over Notre Dame.
Now,
Especially Notre Dame's schedule is better too.
Yeah, I mean, Notre Dame's going to have some chances to impress
They're going to
people.
beat them on both ends on that one.
I mean, it's going to
Well, every team, like what team in front of them wouldn't beat them?
Well, Ohio
Yeah.
State needs other teams to lose. I mean, they just need teams to keep losing twice now.
Yeah.
'Cause
I mean, crazy things are going to happen. I mean, I get in fights with people too much. I get in fights with people at Ohio State Media Day, and I get in fights with reporters, and I come across
you're a
as
hyena.
as a jerk, kind of a jerk sometimes. Things are going to happen. I don't think we can be blind to the fact that some of these teams are going to lose games we don't expect. Baylor lost to West Virginia. Did you have Baylor losing to West Virginia? I did not have Baylor losing to West Virginia.
I didn't pick that game.
But Ohio State could lose to Minnesota too. Like, it's hard to envision the world where what if Notre Dame loses to Louisville? Okay, well, what if Ohio State loses to Indiana? You know what I mean?
It's not like the
things
Michigan
can-
State game is like.
Yeah.
No,
It's
I mean,
a huge.
I don't want to sit here and not talk about the context and just say, well, we'll see what happens on November 8th, because that's boring and, they beat Penn State 63-14 last year, and Penn State's not as good this year. And if at Penn State, do we want to have a half-an-hour show about breaking down Ohio State, Penn State? I do not. I want to talk about the context of where Ohio State fits in the picture. But everything we're talking about is, they have to beat Michigan State, obviously. So there's two things that matter for Ohio State right now. Are they building up as a team to the point to be a team that can go to East Lansing and win? And then the second question is, if that happens, A has to happen first. If A, then B. B is, are they going to be positioned after that win to get where they want to go?
It also depends on what that win looks like, too.
Yeah.
And I think that Urban Meyer is really aware of that. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I know that winning that game in itself was going to be hard enough. If you would have asked me 3 weeks ago if I would have picked Ohio State over Michigan State, I would have looked at you crazy. And now I'm thinking about it. So
we don't know how good Michigan State is right now.
Yeah, they
either,
haven't actually, they've done some good things, and they've won by large margins, but, the little that I've watched them play, I don't watch it going, holy, how
Right.
Ohio State can win
I think
that
their
game.
defense is not the dominant lockdown defense it was
Yeah,
last
Ohio
year,
State
right?
can score on them. But even as our minds start to, anybody who's been reading us all year knows how we've covered this team and the way that we've looked at things, and they can see that it's starting to morph with us.
Right.
Because it's a progression, and it's because this team, it's not because we're making it up, it's because this team is proving and doing things that we didn't think they were able to do.
Right.
And we're reacting to that. So now that I picked Virginia Tech to win because I didn't think Ohio State was very good. Now I'm thinking about picking them to beat Michigan State. So
Right. That's a progression.
That's a progression, and I think that if the committee is really paying attention, then they should be feeling that same type of progression as well.
It's interesting, this Ohio State team right now, Urban Meyer, especially after the Rutgers win, but maybe was more so than any game this year, they dominated. I mean, they handled their business against Rutgers with little problem, and he came in and had a lot of problems. Was their second team good enough? Was the offense good enough? Did they capitalize on everything? The offensive line, he said the last couple weeks actually hasn't been as
very good
as it could have been. JT Barrett, missed a couple throws. We did see that. He missed a couple throws. Quarterback missed throws. It's an interesting dynamic to be a team that has scored 50 points in 4 straight games for the first time in Ohio State history, and the coach comes in and says, okay, not great.
But even after all that, he still was asked, is this a top 10 team? And he said yes.
Right.
So it's hard to gauge even what he thinks.
And they're not a top 10 team. I mean, as it turns out, then the polls come out and they're 12 in the coaches and 13 in the AP. Do you think he's happy? Do you think Urban Meyer feels good about this team, or do you think he has legitimate worries about them getting set up to play a team the caliber of Michigan State on the road?
I'm sure he's worried. I mean, even if they were really good, I'd be worried. I mean, they were really good last year, and
they were
hopefully
really
he was
good
worried.
last year.
Against the Michigan State team they played. Now, I think both teams were probably better at that point last year. But it's the same type of thing, and now it's on the road. And the first time they played, they only won by 1.
Yeah. No, you're right.
On the road. So, I mean,
yeah,
I mean, I think he would be crazy to not be a little concerned. I mean, I think that if Ohio State wins that game, then I really believe that they're going to be on the fast track to some really exciting conversation. And I mean, because like you're saying, we're not even halfway through the season yet. Ohio State's back in the conversation. That was step one. If they're in the conversation, that means that they're making the right type of progress. Now, what they can do, now that they're already in the conversation before getting to Michigan State, I thought they were going to need Michigan State to get back in the conversation. Now they've gotten into that conversation earlier, so maybe that Michigan State win will springboard them further than we all anticipated, especially if they win big. So I think Ohio State's in way better position than I ever thought was even possible after they lost Virginia Tech, especially after the Hokies lost 3 more times after it. I know, I just blew you away.
That was a really good point. That was a good point.